Isaiah chapter 2, verse 10. Enter into the rock and hide in the dust from before the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty. Now, if we compare Isaiah chapter 2 to verse 10 to Revelation chapter 6, verse 15, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9. Let's look at Revelations chapter 6, verse 15. Then the kings of the earth, and the great ones, and the generals, and the rich and the powerful, and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9. They will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might. Let's go back to Isaiah chapter 2, 13 through 16. Against all the cedars of Lebanon, lofty and lifted up, and against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the lofty mountains, and against all the uplifted hills, against every high tower, and against every fortified wall, against all the ships of Tarshish, and against all the beautiful craft. These are all symbols of pride. Solomon used the famous Lebanese cedar wood for his temple. The ships of Tarshish were great ocean-going vessels, the pride of the fleet. Turning to chapter 3, Isaiah chapter 3, verse 14. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders and princesses of his people. It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. The vineyard is the symbol of the nation. Chapter 3, verse 24. Instead of perfume, there will be rottenness. And instead of a belt, a rope, and instead of well-set hair, baldness, and instead of a rich robe, a skirt of sackcloth, and branding instead of beauty. Baldness. Heads were shaved as a sign of mourning. Chapter 4, verse 1. And 7 women shall take hold of one man in that day, saying, we will eat our own bread and wear our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our reproach. So many men have been killed in battle that the women offered to provide their own keep, which is unheard of in those days, if only a man would marry them. Verse 2. In that day the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel. The branch or plant, new growth shooting from old roots. The community is reborn. Let's take a look at Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. Turning back to chapter 4, verse 5. Then the Lord will create over the whole site of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day and smoke and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For all the glory there will be a canopy. The cloud and fire, the symbols of God's presence when they journeyed through the desert. Looking back to Exodus chapter 13, verse 21. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. Turning to chapter 5 in Isaiah, Isaiah's infamous story of the vineyard in chapter 5 captures God's sorrow dramatically, but also reveals his unbending demand that justice be done. God looked for justice, and behold, there was bloodshed. For righteousness, behold, there was outcry. Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7 is the song of the vineyard, and you can compare this to Isaiah 27, chapter 27, verses 1 through 6. The vineyard is God's people, and the gardener is God. The last half of chapter 5 is a chapter of woes, beginning with verse 11. Woe to those who rise early in the morning, that they may run after strong drink, who tarry late into the evening, as wine inflames them. They have lyre and harp, tambourine and flute, and wine at their feast. But they do not regard the deeds of the Lord, or seek the work of his hands. Therefore, my people, go into exile for lack of knowledge. Their honored men go hungry, and their multitude is parched with thirst. Churches flourish in times of hard times. Verse 14, therefore Sheol has enlarged its appetite and opened its mouth beyond measure, and the nobility of Jerusalem and her multitude will go down, her revelers, and he who exults in her. Remember, Sheol is the shadowy world of the dead. Picking up in verse 16 of chapter 5, but the Lord of hosts is exalted in justice, and the holy God knows himself holy in righteousness. Together with a vision of hope in Isaiah, the theme of God's holiness stands out. Again and again, Isaiah calls God the Holy One of Israel. We see this in chapter 5, verse 16, 19, 24, chapter 6, verse 3, chapter 10, verse 20, and so forth. This phrase sums up the majesty of God as King of the universe and as the one who resides in the midst of his people in glory. For Isaiah, Yahweh is both the all-powerful Creator whom we worship and the intimate Savior whom we can approach in the temple and in prayer. Moreover, because God is holy and has made his home in the midst of Israel, he demands all the chosen people a holiness and a righteous living that imitates his own. God's punishment can be expected not because God hates this people or rejects his covenant with them, but because the Lord of hosts is exalted in justice and the holy God reveals his holiness and righteousness. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 26. He will raise a signal for nations far away and whistle for them from the ends of the earth, and behold, quickly, speedily they come. Isaiah does not name the distant nation. Assyria was the immediate threat. Babylon the later one. Chapter 6, Isaiah's call. His friend has died, and he is mourning the death of his friend. He meets with God in a quiet spot he calls a temple, and while there, God gives him a vision. It is likely that Isaiah gathered a group of disciples or fellow prophets around him who treasured and preserved his words. The initial vision of God in all the glory in the temple colored Isaiah's whole mission. He had seen God as the Holy One of Israel, and he never forgot it. He had seen human sin for the appalling thing it is, and he never forgot that either. And he had been forgiven and taken into God's service. Throughout his life, he preached God's righteousness, warned of the judgment on sin, and confronted his people with the knowledge of God's love, his longing to forgive, and all the glories in store for those who remain faithful to him. Isaiah 6, verses 1 through 3, is a heavenly court scene, high and lofty, God's majesty. Isaiah 6:1. In the year that King Uzziah died and saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. Feet in this verse, the whole body is meant. Continue with verse 3. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. Isaiah's commission from the Lord, verse 8. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, Here I am, send me. Can you just imagine this experience? These seraphim and their fluttering wings, flutter, 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 and saying, Holy One, Holy One, Holy One, and the smoke. And I just kind of imagine being in that room. In verse 5, he realizes he needs to say, Woe to me. Isaiah, face to face with God, is overcome with a sense of his own unworthiness. In the Old Testament, it was considered death to see God. And his experience is shared by Moses and Jeremiah in the Old Testament. In Exodus chapter 3 and Jeremiah chapter 1. Luke chapter 5 verse 1 and 2 we read, On one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, He was standing by the lake Gennesaret, and he saw two boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land, and he sat down and taught the people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word I will let down the nets." And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching men." And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. If we turn to 1 Colossians chapter 15, beginning in verse 8, "Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me." Returning to chapter 6 of Isaiah, verse 5, "And I said, Woe to me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Isaiah will go anywhere, anytime, the Lord says. The Lord said to stay right where you are. Verses 11 and 13, "Lord, how long?" And the answer is, until judgment falls. And so we pick up in verse 11 of chapter 6. "Then I said, How long, O Lord? And he said, Until cities lie waste without inhabitants, and houses without people, and the land is a desolate waste. And the Lord removes people far away, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. And though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump." This remnant can be very small indeed, only a stump from the original tree of Judah, and though 1/10 of it remain, it will be burned again. Yet this remnant would also be the source of hope for Israel, because it represents God's promise that he will not destroy Jerusalem or the temple on Mount Zion completely. Turn into chapter 7. The beautiful visions of Emmanuel that fill chapter 7, chapter 9, and chapter 11 came about because Isaiah tried to show Judah's kings that God would stand by them if they remained faithful and would bring about a better day. Ahaz angrily rejected Isaiah's word. Hezekiah could not find the courage to believe them. As a result, Isaiah turned his hopes to a future king who would obey Yahweh. From this moment, the words of Isaiah inspired hopes of a Messiah, a new king in Israel's future, and would better serve God and bring about a full measure of the divine blessing on the land. On your own, read Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 through 6, and chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. Chapter 7, verse 1 through chapter 8 of verse 15, there are 3 signs are given to King Ahaz. Sign of Shir-Jahub, sign of Emmanuel, sign of Meir Shalo-Hashbaz. Isaiah 7, verse 2, when the house of God was told, Syria is in a league with Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. Here this house of David's referred to the royal household. Verse 3, and the Lord said to Isaiah, go out to meet Ahaz, you and Shir-Jahub, your son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field. Shir-Jahub, the name means a remnant shall return. Washer's field or fuller's field, the fuller, cloth maker, needed to be near water for his job of cleaning and whitening clothes. Verse 5, because Syria with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has devised evil against you, saying, Syria and Ephraim, Syria and Ar, once was ruled from Damascus. As predicted, the kingdom was crushed by Assyria in 732. The names of both his sons stood as a constant reminder of Isaiah's teaching. We see this in chapter 8 and chapter 10, verse 20. Returning to chapter 7, verse 14. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose 2 kings you dread will be deserted. Emmanuel in Hebrew means God is with us. The sign seems to have both present and future significance. In the few years it takes for a child conceived and to reach an age when he can choose for himself, Israel and Damascus will cease to be a threat. There will one day be born a child who will truly be Emmanuel, and we read this in Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. The word translated virgin in some versions and in the Greek text is more like English maiden than the technical term virgin. Isaiah chapter 7, verse 15. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. Curds, milk, and honey. These symbols of natural plenty here stand for a wasteland where cattle and bees afford the only remaining food supply. Chapter 8, verse 3, and I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. Then the Lord said to me, call his name Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. The prophetess is Isaiah's wife. Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz means quick loot, fast plunder. The name carries the same initial message as God with us, one of the judgments at the hands of Assyria. Let's compare Isaiah chapter 8, verses 3 through 4, with chapter 7, verses 14 through 16, starting with chapter 8. Because this people has refused the waters of Shiloh that flow gently, and Joyce over reason, and the son of Remaliah. Shiloh was probably an aqueduct outside of Jerusalem. Hezekiah's Siloam tunnel had not been yet constructed. Verse 7, therefore, behold, the Lord is bringing up against them waters of the river, mighty and many, and the king of Assyria and all his glory, and it will rise over all its channels and go over all its banks, referring to the river Euphrates. Chapter 9, verse 1, but there will be no gloom for who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the later time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The way of the sea, the main highway between Egypt and Syria, passed through Galilee. Isaiah chapter 9, verses 2 through 7 is the Messianic passage. Jews point to a Messianic figure. Christians point to Jesus. Chapter 9, verse 4, for the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. The day of Midian's defeat, Gideon's great victory against the Midianites. You can read more about this in Judges chapter 7. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Mighty God, no less than God himself. See chapter 10, verse 21, where the same word is used. Verse 7, of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. An everlasting kingdom. See the angel Gabriel's word of Mary in Luke 1:32 through 33.